We're live. We're getting started. Vice Mayor Rex Richardson here. Thanks for joining us again for CiviTalks LB, the bi-weekly every 2 weeks on Thursday. We're giving updates on things that are happening here in our city or across our region. It's been going well. This is, I think, our third session. The first one in the new year, we talked about, I believe we talked about aviation and our economic recovery. Talked a little bit about, we heard from Seiji from Cal State Long Beach about the way our recovery is K-shaped, and we need to make sure we emphasize inclusion in our recovery to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to thrive in the economic recovery. Our next one, we brought in a few members of AQMD and some folks who wanted to talk about clean technology. And that was an interesting conversation. It allowed us to explore opportunities as it relates to, boosting our economy and cleaning our air at the same time. So I sort of wore my new AQMD board member hat there. Today, we're going to be talking about racial equity. It's an important moment. The president recently, we'll talk about this. The president recently signed a series of executive orders. So that's the top of the government is acknowledging the need for racial equity in housing policy and things like that. Across the region, SCAG, our Southern California region, our largest metropolitan planning organization in America, is taking steps to address equity in our inclusive recovery and in our Connect SoCal regional transportation plan. The county is engaging in equity, making significant advances there at LA County, and here in Long Beach, we've made a commitment to equity. It's a commitment that's evolved over time. It began with things like My Brother's Keeper, our violence prevention plan, things like that. And over time, we began to develop more capacity to understand and talk about it as a problem, ways to address a problem that we all have seen for a very long time, which is the tale of two cities in our city, how certain communities or certain individuals, certain parts of town, based on race or economic factors, have perpetuated the same conditions for many, many years. How do we think about that and talk about that in a way that is smart, data-driven, rooted in policy, rooted in systems? And that has resulted in significant investments into our Office of Equity and the adoption of our Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative, which is being regarded across the region as a model for moving systems. And so we'll have that conversation today. I always start off with some updates. I'll do a few minutes of just quick updates. First, we'll talk about COVID-19. All we're talking about these days are really the vaccination process. The city of Long Beach has become a national leader, a national model on our vaccination process. Congratulations to all the frontline healthcare professionals that have done an incredible job standing up a system to get as many people vaccinated as possible. We've vaccinated 40,000 people already. And if we had more vaccines, we could vaccinate up to 4,000 people a day if we have more vaccines. And so our systems are in order. And so if you see that there's a stop and a start or a slowing, it's really based on supply. As we receive more vaccines, we can issue more vaccines. More than 50,000 people have signed up on VaxLB. That's our vaccination site. You can go to longbeach.gov/VaxLB or call 562-570-4636 if you want to sign up for your vaccine and be notified when it's your turn to be vaccinated for COVID-19. The priority locally has been healthcare workers and seniors, followed by government emergency workers, then food service workers, and now educators. And you're encouraged to talk with your employer if you meet any of those criteria, or you can again just visit our website. So those are some general updates on VaxLB. There was an update just recently on our health order, our stay-at-home order. We know that we've been sort of in a period of escalated restrictions. We haven't been able to have our barber shops, our restaurants, patio seating. It's been a very difficult time for everyone. Just recently, the state of California lifted some of its restrictions. And what that means is that we're seeing improvements in terms of cases and ICU capacity. So this week we were able to open beauty and barber shops and outdoor dining on a limited basis. And so my message to you is support your businesses as you have been supporting your businesses, but continue to be safe. Wear your mask, continue to socially distance, and we can perhaps see more positive outcomes if we continue to do the responsible thing and socially distance. Last week was a pretty good council meeting, big council meeting. A few things took place. One, we passed our first inclusionary housing ordinance in the city. We talked about that at our last CiviTalks. That's important. That ensures that as development happens, that a portion of those new housing units that are developed are reserved for very low-income families. That's incredibly important as we move forward. And we talked about the K-shaped recovery. That's important for the K-shaped recovery. We took a vote on establishing a hero pay ordinance for grocery workers. You probably saw a lot of the news on that the Grocery Association is suing the city of Long Beach, and you'll hear more about that. But I personally stand by our vote. It was the right thing to do. Grocery workers on the front line, I think, is justified, and I think the city council feels good about where we are. And so we'll hear more about that, in the time to come. We also talked about the modernization of the Human Relations Commission. You'll hear about that into our Equity Commission. You'll hear about that today, and then you'll hear a little bit about also, again, the executive orders that President Biden signed related to racial equity, specifically in housing policy, and that aligns with a lot of the work that we've done here in Long Beach. Everyone in Racial Equity Reconciliation Initiative, equity, and so. Equity is the theme of this session. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I've invited a number of key folks, some you know, some you may not know, experts, people that can speak from different points of view on the Long Beach Racial Equity Reconciliation Initiative, as well as efforts across our region and within our county to advance racial equity. So I want to go ahead and introduce some of our guests. I'm going to start with Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza. He's the executive director of the LA County Office of Racial Equity. I've known D'Artagnan for a long time, and I'm honored that he's taken some time to join us. Here's a little bit more about D'Artagnan. In this role, Dr. Scorza will oversee the racial equity initiatives across a jurisdiction of over 10 million people in Southern California, including Long Beach. Previously, Dr. Scorza served as executive director and founder of the Social Justice Learning Institute and president of the Board of Education for Inglewood Unified School District. He's also a lecturer for UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Scorza is a Regent Emeritus. He is a U.S. Navy veteran, and upon return from the Iraq War to his hometown of Inglewood, he created the Urban Scholars Program to help students receive academic support, career pathway guidance, personal growth, and college scholarships. He also wrote and co-authored articles focused on improving literacy practices for youth of color in urban communities. He was recognized as one of the 40 emerging civic leaders under 40 in 2018 for paving the way in advocacy, policy, and philanthropy. He's received the UCLA Regent Graduate Achievement Award in 2016. He's an Education Pioneers Fellow and a Business Alliance for Local Living Economies Fellow, working to end discrimination in rural and urban communities. He serves on the Paths Up Advisory Board, supporting workforce development for technologies that heal chronic disorders in underserved areas. He earned a bachelor's degree in 2007, a doctorate in 2013 from UCLA. Next, we have our deputy city manager in the city of Long Beach, Teresa Chandler. We all know Teresa. She was introduced really on the citywide stage last year. She is our deputy city manager with responsibility of elevating the city's coordinated efforts around homelessness, violence prevention, and youth development. She also provides oversight and leadership to the city's Office of Civic Innovations and the Office of Equity. She recently supported the team through a racial equity and reconciliation planning process to develop a citywide plan to eliminate systemic racism by advancing racial equity in Long Beach. That was our framework for reconciliation process last year. Teresa began her career in the City of Long Beach Health and Human Services Department in 2015 as the city's Homeless Services Officer, and soon after moved into the Health Services Bureau Manager position. In this role, she manages two divisions, homeless services, and community impact, which includes the Center for Families and Youth, that's in North Long Beach, the city's Safe Long Beach Violence Prevention Plan, the Long Beach My Brother's Keeper Initiative, human trafficking, prevention programming, and oversight of the city's trauma and resiliency informed practices, with the goal of turning Long Beach into a trauma and resiliency informed city. It's a big job. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in public health from San Francisco State, and more than 20 years of management experience in both public and nonprofit organization settings. When Teresa first moved to Southern California in 2008, she worked as a program manager for the Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development, the GRID office in the city of Los Angeles, and then moved back into the nonprofit sector as the regional director for community services at Children's Institute in South LA. She also has experience in violence prevention and youth development programs in Oregon, San Francisco, Oakland, and now Long Beach. Teresa's got a lot of experience. Next, we have Katie Valderas, Equity Officer, City of Long Beach. We all know Katie. Katie was doing this for many years, helping us establish the Office of Equity. She's been running the Office of Equity for many years. So she's led the Office of Equity in the City of Long Beach since its launch in 2017. The office coordinates the city's language access program, Human Relations Commission, Governing Alliance for Racial Equity activities, and works on a variety of policy issues, including immigration, cannabis equity, and economic inclusion. Prior to launching the Office of Equity, Katie worked on a variety of public health issues, including asthma, tobacco control, perinatal services, and housing as a social determinant of health. She's an alumni of Cal State Long Beach, where she received her bachelor's degree in psychology, and her master's degree in public health. Next, we have, and thank you for joining us, Katie. Next, we have Alyssa Gutierrez. Alyssa is the chair of our Long Beach Human Relations Commission. Alyssa currently serves as the community's program officer for First 5 LA, a public grant maker and early childhood education organization where she supports community power building and systems change efforts in the cities of Long Beach and Wilmington, with the goal of ensuring children 0 to 5 have families and their families have the resources and opportunities they need to thrive. Ms. Gutierrez also chairs the Long Beach Human Relations Commission, which is our city's independent citizens board that advises the mayor and city council on policies that advance social justice and equity in the city. Prior to First 5 LA, Ms. Gutierrez served as the founding executive director of the Economic and Policy Impact Center, an advocacy and think tank organization that works to expand economic opportunity to disadvantaged communities through civic engagement and leadership development, where she developed leadership development programs and engaged in policy advocacy. In Ms. Gutierrez's role as policy director for 9th District Councilmember Rex Richardson, she led the design and implementation of the city's first economic inclusion initiative, Everyone In, and an economic development strategy that seeks to design policy solutions that deliver economic opportunity for those left behind in the Long Beach economy. Ms. Gutierrez holds a Master's of Social Work with an emphasis of public policy, as well as a bachelor's degree, both from Cal State Long Beach. That is a lot. We have a great panel here of individuals who have a lot to say, and let's get right into the conversation. So let's start off. I want to go to Teresa. Teresa, just most recently, you provided the presentation to the City Council with an update on where we are in the Racial Equity Reconciliation Initiative. Where do you want to start in this conversation?
Well, thank you, Rex. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. Been watching your fireside chats, and they're pretty amazing. The civic chats, and just really honored to be here and to work with you. And so where I would like to start is just a brief update of where we are as a city. So the Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative. I do have some slides that I would like to share. Katie and I are going to go back and forth and just share a little bit of information just so we can show everyone where we are at as a city if people have missed us at council meetings. So if I could get the slides to come up, that would be great. Right. So if we could go to slide number, I guess it would be slide number 2. The next slide, sorry. There you go. Okay. So back one. Back one slide. All right, so I'm just going to start from here. There we go. So just in brief, so where we're at, we started this journey last May. Last May, after George Floyd was murdered, the city council called on the city staff to prepare this framework for reconciliation. And it was an initial report, and then it turned into an initiative after city council approved. At that time, council also identified racism as a public health issue. As you saw from our bios, Katie and I both are public health, masters in public health. And so we're very proud that we now have 2 MPHs sitting in the city manager's office so that we can, continue to infuse that public health lens at that level. And definitely looking at racism as a public health issue was huge for our council to take on. And so the process consisted of 4 key phases. So it started with acknowledging the existence and longstanding impacts of systemic racism in Long Beach and in the country. Then it moved on to listening. So that's listening to accounts and experiences of racial injustice, inequity, or harm to community members. And then I'm going to talk about what that looked like shortly. Then we moved into convening. So that was convening of stakeholders to analyze feedback from the listening sessions and racial disparity data to recommend initiatives that shape policy, budgetary, charter, and programmatic reform. And then finally, catalyzing into action, which is the phase we are in now, which includes immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations that council approved in order to move us forward. And so ultimately, we could not do this work without a clear vision, right? So that vision is that race and ethnicity do not determine social and economic outcomes for those who live and work in Long Beach. And at this time, they do. The data shows us that they do. And so in order to achieve this, we actively have to engage in ongoing initiatives to dismantle and eliminate systemic racism in order to get us there. And to have an initiative like this, it really helps drive the other strategic plans that happen in other across city departments and helps us make that connection. So real quickly, Katie's going to talk about the data that helps to drive this work because everything has to be data informed in order for us to move forward. So if we go to the next slide, Katie's going to share the next 2 slides.
Great, thanks, Teresa. So as Teresa mentioned, the acknowledgement piece was really big. For a long time in the health department, we've been talking about health disparities and the root causes, which we know are deeply rooted in systemic racism, but to be able to finally share the data and to bring it up in such a public forum was, really new for us. And so, just to share a little bit about the data, here in Long Beach, among all full-time workers, white men earn twice as much as Latino women. We know that 1/4 of very low birth weight babies are born to African-American mothers, although they only make up 13% of our total population. When it comes to home ownership, we know that home ownership, owning your own home, is the best way that you can transfer generational wealth to your kids, your grandkids. But we know that because of redlining and a variety of other racist policies, that opportunity is not available for everybody. And hasn't been, over the course of our country's history. And that still shows up in our home ownership rates today, where we see that white families in Long Beach are twice as likely to own their homes compared to Black families. And these are 2 different data sets, but when we pull out the Asian Pacific Islander data and look specifically at Cambodians, we know that rate is even lower, around 23% for our Cambodian neighbors. And then with regards to asthma, our Black residents are hospitalized for asthma almost 9.5 times more often than white residents. And Asian Pacific Islanders are hospitalized more than 3 times higher than white residents. And all in all, when you look at the health data by neighborhood, a lot of these conversations started with our health department director talking about from driving from the health department to City Hall, there was a 7-year gap in life expectancy across zip codes. But when we look at data down to the census tract level, from one side of Long Beach to another, there's about a 17.5-year gap in life expectancy. And so racism is a public health crisis, so we have to address it as such. Next slide. So as Teresa mentioned, the framework for reconciliation was brought by council in June, but we had been sowing the seeds for racial equity long before then. As Rex mentioned, I've been with the health department in the first municipal office of equity. We started slowly since 2017, and there we started just planting seeds. I would say we started with having this office of equity. It was really initially funded by the California Endowment, really focused on health equity and developing a health equity framework. But with leadership across the city, it grew into something so much more. We partnered and were part of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a movement of governments that have really acknowledged that government has long been the creator and the maintainer of racist policies and practices, and so we have to be a part of the solution. So we're working on that. We were part of developing the PolicyLink equity profile for the city of Long Beach, a toolkit for city leaders and staff to be able to apply an equity lens to their work. We've participated in the economic and digital inclusion efforts, as well as diversity and recruitment and hiring efforts, just to get us started. But I think this work is really, the runway by which we take off. Next slide. I'll turn it back over to Teresa to continue talking about the framework.
Thanks, Katie. So there are some of you who are in the audience that joined us through this process. Once Council's direction came in June, we quickly scheduled the first series of listening sessions. And I think within a few days, we had our first series of listening sessions scheduled. And we did them over a matter of about 2.5 weeks. We actually conducted 4 town hall meetings, 17 listening sessions in total, and it collected information through community surveys and staff surveys and emails and conversations with folks. This wasn't an ideal process. We had to do everything virtually because we were in the COVID crisis, and that was new for all of us. We were navigating that. No excuses about the process, but it was hard to navigate through, and we definitely learned some lessons and learned about things we would do different next time as far as outreach to get more folks included into the listening sessions. We listened to nearly 30 hours of listening. Our city leadership sat at the table and listened to community members' accounts and experiences of inequity and harm caused by racial injustice. It was facilitated by an external facilitator, all of them except the first one, because we heard from the community that that's what they would like and feel safer to do. And so we brought in outside facilitators. And then so in total, we had about 560 people joining in the listening sessions and the town halls, but many of those folks participated in multiple sessions. And so it was a fully, about 1,600 voices in total. Some of those repetitive that came back to participate in those sessions. Then we moved into analyzing the data. And so we worked with Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Amber Johnson and her team to dive into the transcripts and the listening sessions and pull out the key themes that came from those sessions. And then we shared the data analysis and the potential goals and strategies with about 50 stakeholders during 2 convenings for feedback and discussion. And then we moved into the creation of the actual report. Next slide. So following the convenings, as I said, the initial report was drafted, and the 4 main goals emerged, right? So under their goals, so it's 4 main goals that are like the top goals, and then 3 to 8 strategies fall under each of those goals. And then from that was about 120 potential actions. So the report got big. And that's great because it kept it broad, and there's a lot that could be packed into those 4 main goals, which we're happy about because that gives us a lot of flexibility in how to move forward into catalyzing into action. So just really quick what those 4 goals entailed. The first one is ending systemic racism in Long Beach in all local government and partner agencies through internal transformation. That's really looking at getting our own house in order, and Katie's going to speak further to that in shortly. The next one is designing and investing in community safety and violence prevention. There's a lot that we can do in regards to community safety. In a week and a half, the city is going to bring forward a youth strategic plan to create an office of youth development, which is super exciting. And as you can see from my bio, that's where my passion lies and a lot of work that I've done. And that really overlays with the work we're doing with reconciliation. Goal 3 is redesigning the police approach to community safety. And Katie is going to speak to that as well. And goal 4 is improving health and wellness in the city by eliminating social and economic disparities in the communities most impacted by racism. And that is everything else that is falls under the health lens. And so we are designing a structure internally as an internal team to move this work forward, but we cannot do it alone, and we do it in partnership with our community stakeholders. Because we can't move forward in that way. We have to work together in order to move this ship. And so if you go to the next slide. Katie's going to go a little bit deeper into each of the goals and the accomplishments that we're currently moving towards.
Thanks, Teresa. Excuse me. There's a lot that has been moving forward. I'm going to just share a couple highlights from each goal that I'm personally most excited about and think have the most potential. Obviously, moving the Office of Equity from the Health Department to the City Manager's Office demonstrates a commitment to prioritizing this work and making sure it has a citywide reach. So furthermore, I'm also just grateful to work under Teresa's leadership. So I think that was something I'm really proud of and has been overdue. Additionally, having our equity champions in all of our departments means that this work is going to be baked into the city structure, and to have each department be developing a racial equity action plan this year means that we're going to start to implement it in how we do business. And we know that comes with training, so we're in the process of implementing trainings for city staff, along with a lot of other activities to try to streamline our procurement process. Look at workforce equity and how we can diversify our workforce and make sure our community is represented at all levels of leadership. Making sure we're measuring our progress and being accountable to what we've committed to doing. And then we know, because we are one system among many, that we have to partner with institutions like Long Beach Unified, Long Beach City College to really focus on dismantling systemic racism. Next slide. Goal 2 is really around this upstream violence prevention. And so this means we have to identify resources because we know that when we get public safety or violence prevention, community safety grants, we get a program going for a few years, maybe even up to 10 years. But as soon as the funding sunsets, it can really leave a lot of that infrastructure weakened. And so it's important that we get structural funding to fund and invest in community safety on an ongoing basis. So we're excited about that. Through Measure US, through some of the structural investments that City Council has made, and in addition to some of the grants that we do need. So Long Beach Activating Safe Communities will focus on safety in the Washington neighborhood. We're also strengthening the network for our reentry folks who are joining us back from the community after incarceration, and making sure that they are welcomed back and provided with the opportunities that they need to be members of our community and be healthy. And then the strategic plan for youth and emerging adults, as Teresa mentioned, is forthcoming to council in a couple weeks. Next slide. Goal 3 is really focused on reimagining police. And I think, one of the things I'm most excited about here is we know that police are asked to do a lot of things that are really far outside of their scope of training. We've got homelessness crises and substance use crisis and conflicts that we need resolved by people who are not showing up necessarily with a badge because they don't necessarily have that mental health or social work training. And so we're really excited to look at what the alternate systems for addressing nonviolent calls for service look like. We have a couple really good starts in Long Beach with our HEART team and our MET team, but we can definitely expand on that and find ways that we're having people who are trained for the situation show up when they're called. There's also been a lot of work moving forward related to Citizens Police Complaint Commission. Now officer-compelled statements are available for the commissioners, and they're looking at bringing in an outside reviewer to assess how the CPCC stands compared to other oversight bodies. Additionally, the police departments started an Office of Constitutional Policing with whom we partner with to really work on a lot of the things that were outlined in the reconciliation report. And we're just chipping away at some of the tasks, both big and small, and looking forward to their continued commitment to 21st century policing. And then last slide. And then finally, this is kind of the everything else, because we know that racism is pervasive in all systems. And so this is really trying to get at that. We want to, CARES Act is a drop in the bucket to meet the need. And we know it's been really challenging to get the money out the door, but we really did try to have an equity lens focus on digital inclusion, Black health equity, mental health, and a bunch of other different things that we can invest that money in. But we also are working to bake in equity into our climate action adaptation plan, economic equity in our resiliency and recovery plan, affordable housing through things like inclusionary housing, health equity, cannabis equity, and so much more. So there's a lot going on, and we're just trying to coordinate it all and make it as honest and truthful to the commitments that we have to community through, dismantling systemic racism and white supremacy in our government system. So I think that's it. For our slides. Tried to power through them. This is a lot of information. Cool, thank you.
So Rex, as you know, we could keep talking about it, but I'll turn it back
Oh,
over to
sorry,
you
I was
since
muted.
this is
Forgive
your
me.
shop, and then
I was muted.
we can follow up with questions.
Okay, let's go ahead and take that screen down. We'll get into the conversation. We want to pull more folks into the conversation now. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that there's 41 participants here. You have a chat section on the right column, on the right side. You also have a Q&A section, and after we hear from D'Artagnan and Alyssa, we're going to get into a fireside chat. We're going to pull questions in and all of that stuff. So make sure you use that. So I'm going to transition, invite D'Artagnan in the conversation. But before I do, I want to acknowledge the presentation. So, a lot of times I'm in my role as SCAG president, or throughout the years when we were talking about equity, we get challenged with the question, is this a political conversation or is it a professional standard? There was a culture within our city at one point that you couldn't talk about politics as city staff. And racial issues fell in that category of politics. And it wasn't an easy transition to take it out of that column of this is political, we don't talk about it, and bring it into the mainstream and confront city council with it, confront the community with it. And it took, honestly, we had been inching toward this, but it really, the tipping point was the unrest and George Floyd and death in Minneapolis. And I think, his murder in Minneapolis. And I think what that meant to a lot of cities were, I always think back to the My Brother's Keeper summit that I attended, I think in 2016 at the White House. And at that summit, I was on a panel with the mayor of mayor of Minneapolis, the very same city, right? And they were being recognized at the White House for their commitment to equity and their commitment to boys and men of color. And then 4 years later, the very city, you witnessed from that very city, a culture within the police department that could take someone's life. This concept of banality, you do it just out of duty, just out of, I'm just following orders, or I'm just, doing my job. No real critical evaluation of what was actually happening. You just did it out of the banality, killed this man in the very same city. And it was a wake up call to every city, in my opinion, that we need to check under the hood. If it could happen, if a situation like that could happen in Minneapolis is smaller than Long Beach. It could happen in Long Beach or many other cities in America. And it called on all of us to do a real examination of where we are as it relates to racial equity. And the way I talk about it, and I say this because, it makes me proud to see you, Teresa, and you, Katie, talking openly about race in a way that is safe and open. And we'll get better at it. Right? This wasn't something we were all good at before, but you'll get better at it. But the one thing I'll say before we go to D'Artagnan is I think there's a transition of becoming political to professional standard. Years ago, when folks talked about harassment, it was very similar. You didn't talk about harassment in the workplace. Harassment was something that was very narrowly defined. I can look the other way. Now it's very different. If there's a culture of harassment in a professional setting, in a corporate setting, in a public sector setting, you can't advance. You cannot move up and become a city manager with a bunch of harassment issues. You cannot cultivate an environment with a lot of harassment. But what did it take to get there? It took training. It took accountability. It took a lot to make that pivot from a political issue to an actual professional standard. And that's what needs to happen with race and implicit bias, in my opinion. That's what's happening now. You need to see HR and systems changing, and all of these things that create a culture of equity, where we are rewarded the better we are at understanding implicit bias and all of those things. You can move up and become a city manager, move up and become a leader of an organization. And so, speaking of leaders of organizations, D'Artagnan, I want to pull you into the conversation right now. I know that we've programmed on My Brother's Keeper work in the past. We all admired what you did as executive director of Social Justice Learning Institute. You've done work in Inglewood. You've done work at Jordan High School in Long Beach. And now you get to help set the table for LA County, if you will, as it relates to all the things, all the different departments LA County has, even the independent ones yesterday, like the Office of Education. So why don't you come into the conversation? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what's happening regionally, and what's happening generally in this movement.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Vice Mayor, for the invitation tonight. I got to tell you, it's just been such a pleasure and a joy to even watch the work that you all are presenting, Kitty and Teresa, and the leadership that you have exhibited here in the city of Long Beach. So, yeah, you've talked a little bit about my background, but I think what underscores a lot of the work for me is my own lived experience, right? Having grown up in conditions of concentrated disadvantage, having grown up with family members who were incarcerated, with a father who was, incarcerated because of his addiction to drugs, right? I understand from a sort of very intimate and lived experience way that these policies that our government has implemented and has effectuated upon our lives can have such a significant effect upon people. And so, for me, the work is about more than just, the policy change we're trying to accomplish, which is very, very important. It's really about helping to transform the material conditions that people face so that ultimately, right, people can thrive. Black folk in Los Angeles County and throughout this country can thrive. Immigrants can thrive. People who are typically marginalized, folk who are disabled can thrive. Trans communities can thrive, right? That's what this is about. So I can tell you a bit about the work we're doing here in LA County. And frankly, I was honored to have been selected to come on board to the county and work in the CEO's office, coordinate across the many departments that the county has, as well as some of the independent agencies to support a policy agenda and activities focused on anti-racism. In July of 2020, then Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas authored a motion that had really built upon work that was previously being done in the county. I mean, back in 2015, the county had focused on bringing implicit bias trainings forward for county departments. They had begun to host equity summits and really began to explore what equity looks like, not only at sort of a systems level, but also within departments. And so as you all have recognized, when George Floyd was murdered, it created not only a sense of outrage, but also urgency and an opportunity for doing that work here in Los Angeles. And so the board boldly affirmed that racism is not only a matter of public health in Los Angeles County, but that specifically racism against Black people has reached crisis proportions. And that because of that, it's resulted in large disparities in family stability, health and mental wellness, education, employment, and many other areas that affect the lives of Black folk. So the board established an anti-racist policy agenda as its 8th board-directed priority. There are 9 directives that are in the board's motion, and they call for a number of activities for my unit. Specifically, what I'm called upon doing is evaluating the county's policies, practices, operations, and programs so that they promote racial equity for African Americans and for all marginalized communities. My goal is, and another one of the directives is to assess existing personnel policies, procedures, and practices that may prevent African Americans from promoting and from advancement within the county. Further, to address issues related to Black homelessness or environmental justice or housing, as well as to commission a report on the state of Black Los Angeles County. And so, I'm currently working to establish, in fact, a research unit with partners from UCLA, USC, and Charles Drew University, as well as a number of experts and leaders in the field, like Arnold Chandler from Forward Change Consulting, and Policy Link, as you all have been able to work with, as well as the Prevention Institute, to identify not only a set of metrics and indicators that we want to track, but to lift up sort of our North Star, right? And for us, it means that we're going to develop a set develop an index of well-being, right? And identify the goals that demonstrate the types of outcomes we'd like to achieve. So, for example, knowing that many of our families are housing burdened, one of our indicators will be to increase housing stability by X% by a certain number of years. So in thinking about that, and imagining the county as a $38 billion institution with a homelessness initiative, with multiple departments that provide services that are focused on protecting family, that are also focused on addressing some of the welfare needs that our families may have. Part of what Artie and part of what my unit is responsible for doing is to think about how we bring the county's multiple departments and services together so that we can ultimately rethink how we're doing our work. And what I mean by that is for a very long time, the county has been used to providing services and addressing the needs of our communities, right? For example, if a community needs mental health services, the county is there to provide that. That's the domain of the county most often. However, what we're doing in Artie and in our racial justice unit is getting our multiple departments and county partners to start thinking about how their services align so that we help people thrive. So we move towards an agenda that builds upon the services that we're providing and also help facilitate a good life for people, right? So that means we're working on unified data systems that allow us to track services that people are receiving and understand whether or not their services are actually impacting their lives and improving outcomes in their lives. Furthermore, by establishing this organizational unit within the CEO's office, it's allowed me to work across the many departments to build out a strategic plan that will then lead to department-specific equity plans, as well as a platform that will help us recommend and advocate for legislative policies that improve outcomes and reduce racial disparities. Now, when you think about racism, and this is such a great conversation because we're openly talking about racism, right? We understand that it's pervasive and that it's typically, woven throughout social institutions as well as embedded within folks' individual consciousness. And so our team is currently working on a racial sort of equity training core, much like what you all are doing with your train the trainer model, so that as we work with our 110,000 county employees, we have experts, internal experts, who are able to bring to bear their expertise in ways that support growth and development within departments. As we think about anti-racism, right, for us, it's really sort of grounded in this understanding that it's the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, as well as attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably, right? It's about an active approach to doing this work and not sort of waiting for things to change. Some of the things that I'm currently engaged in the county is to build upon the efforts that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, the county has been deeply engaged in implicit bias training, in equity work. I think our arts department, which is our Department of Arts and Culture, is one of the first of a kind in the country, has led with equity, right? That's how they actually began their work. And they're currently serving as a model for arts organizations around the country. But what I'm intending to do is build upon those efforts, as well as connect them to some of the national effective practices, so that as we create our training frameworks, as we create our policy frameworks, as we evaluate our procedures and practices, we're able to rely upon the success of jurisdictions like Long Beach and others like Portland, Seattle, Chicago, and others. We're also working on a policy agenda which aligns racial equity motions. So at the county level, the Board of Supervisors pass these motions that call for the inclusion of racial equity as a framework to evaluate the success or the degree to which these motions are actually improving people's lives. For example, the board has recently and boldly launched an initiative called Alternatives to Incarceration, which has identified a number of recommendations to help reduce the population, the inmate population in not only Men's Central Jail, but in our youth camps and within probation in our prison systems as well. The county also has an Office of Diversion and Reentry, as well as an Office of Violence Prevention, the Center for Health Equity, the African American Infant and Maternal Mortality Initiative, as well as an Office of Equity within the Department of Children and Family Services. Furthermore, the county has also passed a motion to address issues related to hate crimes. So as we've seen over the past 4 years, hate crimes have increased dramatically in many of our communities across the country, and certainly Los Angeles has not been without exception. Now, we know that we've been dealing with COVID, and COVID is a significant issue for all of us, and has affected everyone's lives, from our children to our elders, and many of us who have had families that have been affected or have lost loved ones as a result of COVID. Yet, when COVID is over, part of what we're going to have to think about is how we recover, rebuild, and reimagine the future, right? And part of what the county is thinking about right now is how we can build a focus on economic resiliency that creates a pathway for investments into safe, healthy, and inclusive economic opportunities in a post-COVID-19 world. The idea is to look at the county's infrastructure projects, often ones that are managed by Public Works, as a vehicle to advance active and anticipated infrastructure projects that have more inclusive contracting practices. Furthermore, voters, and many of you who are on this, who are here today, approved Measure J, which requires that no less than 10% of the county's locally generated unrestricted revenues address the disproportionate impact of racial injustice and incarceration in LA County. What that measure has done is it's established an inclusive and transparent process to allocate funds to support direct community investment and alternatives to incarceration. And I have to say, because of the leadership of people in our community, there is a 17-member Reimagine LA Advisory Committee that is comprised of 5 folk with lived experience, appointees from the board, as well as county representatives, who are currently evaluating and making recommendations on the types of investments that can be made in a CARES First, Jails Last system. Finally, in November of this past year, the county passed a motion that will assess our current child abuse prevention efforts, as well as effectively address racial inequities and systemic racism in our family and children's services sector. This, which is an effort that's being led out of my office as well, will evaluate how various county departmental efforts can be leveraged to align with national effective practices to ensure that we're reducing the pipeline of families that are moving into the system, right? Children who are going into foster care, children who are being removed from their homes, et cetera, but to also make sure that while we're doing that, we're protecting those families. So where we're currently at, and I have to say, I'm a little bit over 30 days into this role. So I would love to say we are as far along as you all are here in Long Beach, but that is certainly not the case. But I will say, since I've arrived, not only have we spent a lot of time aligning the existing efforts that are underway within the county, but I've been able to come in and work very closely with my county family to help plan while also avoiding planning fatigue. And so what we've currently identified as a priority is building out our strategic plan so we have both an internal framework that addresses some of the sprawl, right? The county has 110,000 employees, more than 37 departments, a number of independent agencies that fall within sort of the purview of the charter. But what we are working on right now is aligning the work that has taken place and the work that needs to take place, as well as the ongoing and emerging initiatives, into a framework, and frankly, a framework that we believe will help address structural racism. Which for us, structural racism is both it's also institutional, spatial, and relational, right? Institutional in that it is grounded in the policies, the practices, and procedures that many of our both private and public agencies and corporations and entities engage in, as well as spatial, meaning locationally. Communities serve as a container, or locations can serve as a container for inequities and inequality. And then relational, in the sense that it's because of our social networks and our connection to people that certain outcomes continue to persist in people's lives, or the lack thereof, right? The lack of their connection to certain relationships. And as we think about this, for us, the unifying framework is what's called the life course framework, which will help us identify the unfair disparities that exist across people's life course outcomes. And moreover, disparities that are passed on from generation to generation, which produce disparities for years to come. So, for example, if we know that in the state of California, if a black male does not graduate high school by the time that he is supposed to do so, he has almost a 92% chance of being incarcerated in his lifetime. And we know that if someone is incarcerated in their lifetime, and let's say they had a family, that will affect the future prospects of the next generation. So what we're thinking about in the county is how we not only have an intergenerational approach to this work, but how we adopt a life course framework that looks at the indicators that keep people on track as well as the ones that take them off track. And then align county services so that we are addressing both on and off track indicators, investing in the future of our young folk, but as well as ensuring that our elders and families and parents in our communities receive the services and the support that they do. And think about it from a 360 perspective, right? A 360-degree perspective. Understanding that the life of a child and the life of a parent are both intertwined and must be addressed simultaneously. So in considering not only the role that structural racism plays in our lives through the laws and the organizations and the markets that, as well as the sort of the private and public actions that occur, but we recognize that all of these things affect us in an intersectional way. And in the county are building out a strategic plan that is going to be based upon that, as you heard the equity team say earlier, that relies upon sort of a geospatial and multiple social determinants of health framework, as well as sort of a racial analysis, because we know even if you are socioeconomically sound, even if you don't live in a community of concentrated disadvantage, for example, if you are a black woman who lives in Ladera Heights or View Park or Baldwin Hills, when you go to the doctor, you still are 3 times more likely to face maternal health challenges and issues related to infant mortality than your white counterparts, right? Race can play a significant role, as we saw with what just happened in Indiana with the black physician who was infected with COVID, who was not treated well by her white counterparts and colleagues.
Right.
So we'll be with data. And then finally, and this is certainly not least, but work to engage our community by developing a robust community and stakeholder engagement plan that incorporates both our philanthropic partners as well as our multiple cities, the 88 cities, 80 school districts, so that as we consider equity for LA County, it is both inclusive but also comprehensive, and will rely upon the leadership of local jurisdictions like Long Beach, as well as regional ones like SCAG, to help advance a racial equity agenda for Los Angeles County and for the Southern California region, and hopefully for the nation, the state and the nation, for years to come. So, Rex, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be here tonight, and look forward to taking additional questions.
Well, D'Artagnan, thank you so much. You definitely gave us a lot, but you and I have talked for a long time. I knew what to expect. You're gonna cover the whole gamut. We're gonna move the conversation. I want to get to the discussion a little bit, but a few things popped up. I want to acknowledge. You said active approach. Keyword active, right? That's the operative word there. And the reason it's active is because, something I like to say is that systems, we live in systems and structures, and they are not neutral. If you see patterns of disparity happening in your community for generations, it's because that's what the system is designed to do. So by doing nothing, the system continues to operate. So in order to change the system, you need a systems change approach. That's simple, an active system change approach that is superior and more inclusive in the system in place, because that system that's in place is laced with the values of race and gender from the time that system is instituted. That's the concept of systemic, why you have to have a systemic approach. So thank you for lifting up active approach. You mentioned in your county process, you're setting up an organizational team. That's similar to what Katie mentioned. We're doing in the city of Long Beach, standing up an organizational team across departments. You're creating a citywide plan, your county-wide plan. That's our racial equity and reconciliation initiative. Then you're creating department-wide plans, as Long Beach is doing it. It's a lot of alignment, keyword alignment in that process. So as we refine the process, we'll be able to learn from each other. You mentioned a training core. That goes back to institutionalizing. It needs to be institutionalized across government. You mentioned Um, focus on resiliency. That we know that that's happening at SCAG. We know that's happening in the city of Long Beach, and it's happening in the county. The focus on resiliency. So I think what I gleaned from your comments is a lot of alignment and opportunity there. And speaking of alignment and opportunity, we have an opportunity to align our Human Relations Commission with a lot of this incredible work. Before we had an Office of Equity, before we had an equity plan, we had our Human Relations Commission. And the history there rooted in the civil rights movement. And a lot of times human relations was masking. It was a mask for saying the things that government wasn't comfortable saying, like race or LGBTQ or black or racism. And so now we have an opportunity in the way that we're modernizing our CPCC. We have an opportunity to modernize our Human Relations Commission. Alyssa Gutierrez, Alyssa, you've got a lot of, you were doing a lot of this work from day one, when you were a part of my team, when you were at Economic Policy Impact Center, and now you're in a place to be able to help lead this as the chair of the Human Relations Commission and make sure that there's a resident voice in the process. So what are your thoughts on this equity moment that we're in?
Yeah, well, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me, Vice Mayor. It's great to be here with each of you. I'm happy to be in the company of friends, see a lot of friends in the audience, so really appreciate the opportunity to share this time and space with you all. It's certainly an exciting time in Long Beach. We are experiencing probably one of the greatest challenges in our lifetime, and yet we get to be a part of the solution. Right, and so it's exciting to be able to really uncover the opportunities and the challenges before us and reimagine what's possible for our city and our society. And what we're seeing with the framework for racial equity and reconciliation, this explicit and bold declaration of the city's commitment to dismantling systemic racism is huge. Right, we've heard this all night. This is a big deal. So just want to thank you all, Vice Mayor, for your leadership, and Teresa and Katie for coordinating the implementation, navigating the messy bureaucracy, and just holding firm to your values and making real systemic progress along the way. So just wanted to celebrate that for a second. As the commission has been setting our intention and developing our vision for what's possible, I've been reflecting on just how far we've come as a city to be in the place we are today, having this very conversation, which I think several have alluded to. But what we see today, everything that Katie and Teresa talked about, is really the result of a decade of community organizing and power building and a very intentional inside-outside strategy between leaders like Vice Mayor Richardson and community activists. And I think acknowledging that history is important, acknowledging the groundwork that began being laid, with the election of new city council members who were committed to working alongside community activists to push a progressive policy agenda that really centered the needs of marginalized communities in a way that Long Beach hadn't seen before. And then at the same time, on the outside, California Endowment had made a historic investment in Long Beach with their Building Healthy Communities initiative. I think Katie mentioned, her position was first funded by California Endowment as well. But BHC and that initiative really catalyzed the networked coalitions and community activism that we see today. And I think really paved the way for this activated and engaged citizenry that's not only able to give cover to bold progressive leadership to be able to advance these types of policies, but in fact are demanding them. Right, so I've been able to be a part of this journey both from the inside and the outside, and was part of those early days in the city, right, when it wasn't popular or cool to pursue equity and justice. And on some days it felt like we were going up against the whole institution. And in many ways we were. Right, I'll tell you, I've never had more appreciation for progress than I did after working inside government, working for a progressive leader, working on advancing a progressive policy agenda, and having to deal with the real just persistent resistance to naming inequity and resistance to change. And there's still a lot of work to do. But if we don't stop and reflect and appreciate where we've been, we could easily take for granted where we are. So I think I've really come full circle, right? I think I've really come full circle now, being in the position to lead the commission through this modernization. And I think Vice Mayor was mentioning, commission has had a pretty long history in Long Beach. The most recent revival was in 1989 in response to a race-related police brutality incident, and was really created with the intent of recommending policies that promote goodwill and better relations among people. Using a human relations framework to address racism and other forms of bigotry, is a bit outdated in that it's rooted in this belief it's rooted in this belief that the root of racism is about like an individual level intolerance to difference without a critical understanding of racism as a fundamental power construct, a power construct that's rooted in white supremacy, that gives power to categorize and judge and elevate and downgrade and include or exclude, and avoids the naming of the systemic nature of racism, which unfortunately moves us further away from being able to dismantle it, because you can't dismantle what you refuse to see. So using a diversity, equity, inclusion framework to addressing racism in all its forms is really in line with a modern approach and best practices for advancing equal opportunities for communities. And so our current ordinance and framing is outdated. It's a bit limiting even in the way that it was written and what we're able to do in our official capacity. But I'll say that the commission has always found a way to stay nimble and adapt with the times, and has been a longtime ally and advocate in the Long Beach, justice activist space. Just a few years ago, did a lot of work around modernizing our mission and vision to better reflect the core of our work to really center equity and justice at its core. So the focus and orientation is already that of working towards systems change, which the definition I like to use is shifting the conditions that are holding a problem in place. With the framework, it now gives us a tangible roadmap in front of us. So with the framework, we saw an opportunity to really step up and advocate for ourselves as a commission to be that independent accountability arm to really put some teeth into this plan. Some ideas for how we could shift our role include being able to work with city staff in the Office of Equity to support implementation of the framework. And there's precedent for this in the city. The Economic Development Department has a Commissioner Champion program where commissioners are involved in implementing the city's blueprint for economic development. We could serve as a review board for future plans that address equity issues. The commission can vet ideas and programs and projects before they come to the full city council. I know there's a couple other commissions that operate in that way. We can serve as an accountability review board for the racial equity action plans that city departments are now required to create, and make recommendations on the development and implementation of those plans, and really be a thought partner in that way. So there's a whole lot of ideas, I think, floating around right now on what our revised role could or should look like. So we'll actually be engaging community partners in the next month to hear more from you all on how you think we would be most affected in this revised role, and then take all of that data and work with city manager's office to come up with a recommendation for council to vote on, thinking that might happen sometime in April or so. So more to come on that. But our commissioners are eager. They're eager to contribute. They're eager to be seen as an institutional asset and a partner in advancing this work. And what we bring is the community lens. And the expertise in advancing equity. Most of us do this type of work in our day jobs. So I think the commission, with our connection to community and understanding of the work before us, really position us to be able to help operationalize the recommendations in the framework and other types of equity initiatives more broadly. And will help close the institutional gap around community voice. And last thing I want to underscore is that, equitable community engagement is the foundation of creating equitable core government functions. Functions like budgeting and how we allocate resources and planning and program development and policy making. And institutionalizing equity requires that government operate fundamentally different than it does today. It's a paradigm shift, to be sure. And incorporating community voice into your processes and your design and your decision making is really more than checking a box. Really, at its core, it's about sharing power and sharing power with community. And it requires city staff and leaders to trust that marginalized communities and those closest to the problems that we're seeking to address are also closest to the solutions. And, that's why when over-policed communities are asking for less police in their communities and more investment in their communities, they know what they're talking about and they know what they need. And what government can do, what you all, policymakers and those implementing the framework must do is value and trust the insights of disinvested communities in order to develop solutions that will work and be sustainable. And this shift in mental models and practices is really, I think, where the real equity work is going to happen. And it's really the only proven strategy for ensuring that public actions, consistently further equity. So I'm really excited for where we are in Long Beach and, just honored to be able to lead the commission through this really important transition. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, for your thoughts on the commission. Just some things I picked up. It was a great statement. You said shift conditions holding problems in place. I wrote that down. And that goes back to what we talked about. The problem is systems. A lot of times when we think about an issue, we place the problem on individuals, right? If this young boy, this young man, if we could just fix that person, we can fix the problem. And, how do we fix this person? How do we fix this person so that they can do better? Where we should be asking questions about the system. What are the conditions that are in place that are perpetuating these outcomes, and how do we address those systems? So I thought that really resonated. I think when you talk about accountability, it's really the city council's job to hold people accountable. That's who's elected. For the city council, we have a part-time city council in our city. Our official mechanism for public engagement is our commission. That our commissions in the city are our official way to get broader stakeholder input on and advise the city council on decisions. And so the Human Relations Commission needs to be updated. And I think from top to bottom, I think even in thinking about how we select commissioners, a lot of times if we leave it to the city council to select a commission, one person per district, a lot of times it turns into an echo chamber of the city council. Whereas we should be thinking about how do we reach into populations based on an equity lens. We design a commission based on an equity lens, impacting people, make sure certain voices are represented intentionally. So I think the Equity Commission fundamentally should look different than every other commission. And that's something I'm going to be looking forward to. I think, and you also said paradigm shift. Things have to look and feel differently. If we're going to really galvanize our city and create, diminish this story to tell two cities. I think Katie talked about Kelly's drive to the office, how within a mile or so, you got 7-year difference in life expectancy. That's not going to be easy to change. Somebody in the chat is talking about environmental justice. All of these things and transit equity, all of these issues are connected. It simply comes down to fundamentally, how do we ensure that everyone in the city has a common standard of dignity and health and an opportunity to thrive? And that means we have to look at each and every system, from transportation to health, air quality, representation. housing. All of these things are connected. So it is a paradigm shift. It's a massive paradigm shift. So let's jump into, we have, it's a big topic. So everybody spoke for a long time, and that's okay. We didn't get as much Q&A, but we're going to get some of this before our time runs out here. We're going to get into the conversation. I talked a little bit about, I see there's 2 questions in the chat about climate, environmental justice, environmental racism. I touched on it a little bit. But I think the way we're going to take this is, how do we operationalize, make sure that it's the city's job to factor environment and environmental justice into our plan to expand and advance equity. So I'm going to go to Katie. Katie, what do you think? How do we make sure that climate is factored into our racial equity efforts within the city?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. It's such a critical equity issue. I mean, this is admittedly an issue that I've had to learn a lot about in my time at the health department, but I think the Climate Action Adaptation Plan and the way that they really uplifted marginalized voices into the shaping and creation of that plan has been a really intentional racial equity approach to it. It has some big, bold goals and strategies that they want to achieve to not only address climate change, but also mitigate the impacts of climate change, because we know it's happening. And, we know that some communities without tree cover, are going to be more likely to be impacted by it. And we know that those fall along racialized lines. And so I think the Climate Action Adaptation Plan is a good start, but, like everything, it requires investment and commitment and accountability. So, that's what I'm excited about, but also, cautiously optimistic, because I want to make sure that it comes to life.
I think there's, there's more to it. I mean, what we're talking about is the air people breathe and the lack of open space in certain areas of town, and invest and build a park. A lot of times it's based on where the opportunity was, or who was able to secure a grant to get something done, and not necessarily done with an intention of closing the balance, where you see North and West Long Beach with 1 acre of open space per 10,000 people, and other parts of town with 10 and 11 acres of open space per 10,000 people. If the mission of the organization is to close that gap, then we have to see grant applications and plans that actually speak to that. And then, representation is important. Our last CiviTalks, we brought in members of AQMD. I'm joining, my first AQMD meeting is on the 5th. I think this is directly related. North Long Beach is the intersection of 710-91 freeway. We've never had a seat. We've never had a representative on AQMD since its inception, not once. And this is one of the dirtiest freeway intersections in the history of our city. And I learned a lot. I'm going to pull D'Artagnan in on this one. But I learned a lot about race and institutional racism and the dynamics across race as it relates to environmental justice. I'm bringing D'Artagnan in because, D'Artagnan, your background, you've seen what it's like, the dynamics that Black communities deal with and Black leadership deals with as it relates to moving an agenda around the environment. And I'd love to pull you in on this, maybe share some of your insights formally with your role at SJLI.
No, I appreciate that. And just, not only through my role at SJLI, but as a UC region, one of the top priorities for me was environmental sustainability, and call it sort of, the economy, the environment, and equity, right? The 3 E's. And they all go together. And the reason why, and not only that, but I did a lot of work in sort of helping to push the UC system to adopt policies and their proxy voting policies to divest from, companies that were not as climate friendly, right? To have an ESG policy in place, and to make sure that we were really focused on addressing issues like climate change, not only there, but in the community. So when I came back to Inglewood, I actually came back before I was even thinking about being on the school board as a sustainability advisor for the Inglewood Unified School District. It's sort of a volunteer role to help the district think strategically about how we were going to improve and advance environmental justice with our own youth, not only through like educational opportunities and programs, but in the built environment, right? So one of the things, place is such an important component when we begin to talk about environmental justice, and we're going to talk about the role that the environment plays, not only as it relates to air quality, but as it relates to water quality in our communities and access to clean water, to fresh air, to green space, et cetera, but also dealing with issues like urban heat island effect, right? Not having enough shade trees in our community. So when grandma needs to go to the store and she's walking down the street, she doesn't have to stop every 6 blocks or a mile because it's just overwhelmingly hot because she lives in an area that's been entirely concretized, right? And so when we think about this, some of the work that I've done at SGLI was to create a greening plan for the city of Inglewood and neighboring Lenox that explored water and transportation to improve access to things like electric vehicles for communities in affordable ways, to make sure that we planted fruit and shade trees, to make sure that people were able to have affordable housing and be able to breathe fresh air, and pushed LAWA to invest in residential sound insulation and mitigation funds so that we could address sound and noise pollution living near the airport. So when you say, Rex, that it's difficult sometimes to get a lot of traction in this area, I think that's true, because often people don't believe that Black folk or people of color, care about the environment, right?
Exactly.
That we don't talk about the CalEnviro screen, that we don't look at the conditions. And the truth is it's not that Black folk don't care about the environment, or people of color don't care about the environment, or immigrant communities don't care about the environment. It's that we talk about it differently. We don't say, hey, let's deal with the urban heat island effect, or let's deal with watershed issues. We say, you know what? It's too damn hot outside, and we need to plant some more trees so we can have shade when we walk to the store, right? We say, my baby has asthma, and we need to have clean air. Or we say, that Exide plant that's up the street from my house is causing me to be nauseous. That needs to be cleaned up and fixed. Or we turn on the water, as was the case in the Sativa district, and we say, I'm having brown, rusty water come out of my pipes. Y'all need to make sure we have clean water, right? We don't talk about it based upon the ways in which some of our communities on the West Side might talk about it and use the same language, but we do talk about the same things, and we do care about the same things. And I think we have to reframe, right, how people with lived experience who are dealing with the challenges associated with poor land use policies or environmental issues are dealing with. And the final thing I'll say is this. The other thing our communities talk about is environmental gentrification. How when things are improved in a community and the amenities improve, people from more mainstream communities move in and the rents go up and they get displaced.
You get pushed out.
From that perspective as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think you're right in talking about culture has a lot to do with it. I mean, I experienced that, and we breathe it, we live it. The CalEnviro screen, we see it every day. We wash the things off of our car almost daily. And people wonder why there's so many car washes in North Long Beach. It's because there's so many freeways in North Long Beach. It's hard to keep our cars clean. But the reality is, we get put into these conversations as if we don't care about. We have to choose one or the other between our clean air, our environment, and our ability to thrive or have a job, because it's linked. Poverty is linked to the environment. And you have to think about both sides. You need clean, quality, green jobs that are accessible to people who live in these communities. And we need to set the policies in place to clean up those communities. It's interconnected. And we have no choice but to be invested in both, not just one, but both, as Blacks and Latinos and people of color in our city. I see another question I want to pull in, and I know we're getting. I know we all got little ones, and we set a commitment to try to be done by 6:30, and I want to be able to respect that. But I want to pull Teresa in. So there's a conversation about transit equity and Long Beach Transit, and like D'Artagnan's, like in LA County, they have departments that have their own boards, very separate, right, independent. Like LA County Office of Equity, that's not Office of Education. That has its own governing board, not the Board of Supervisors. And here in Long Beach, we have the same with our transit agency. It has its own governing board, but it's the city's transit agency. Port of Long Beach has its own governing board, the city water department, airport. How are we planning to make sure that our transit system, which is incredibly important to equity, our transit system is factored in as we implement our racial equity reconciliation initiative, and that these adjacent departments go through their own process. And I'll also just underscore as it relates to transportation, in Long Beach, and this has been the issue that I've always grappled with. In Long Beach, we have, our bikes are maintained by the city, the bike share program. The scooters are private. Our train, Metrolink is the Metro, right? Then you have Long Beach Transit with the buses. You have 3 different decision-making bodies separately making decisions about how people move around our city. 3 different governing bodies. So as it relates to discussions like rates and fees and things like that, it's hard to make a decision. It's hard to move 3 systems at once. So how are we going to, as Long Beach, make sure that transportation and these other agencies are also moving along on this march toward equity?
Sure. That's a good question, and it is a very big task with all these different entities that are out there, with their own plans and their own structures. But as Katie spoke to, and the way that we have been moving already is we've been doing pretty much road shows. We're going out there, we're talking about the work of the reconciliation plan. We have to connect with all these other structures. And so we have a really good model, and I'll use the harbor, for example. So immediately they were engaged in the process when we were at the EOC, at the Emergency Operations Center. When we were responding to COVID, we put together a small equity team that was focused on equity in response to COVID. And we had representatives from Harbor in that. And so they became part of our equity leadership. And so now we are meeting with the Harbor team. We have equity champions from Harbor who are also represented, and we're meeting with them monthly. We have ongoing conversations, and as they're designing a plan as well, they have a lot of best practices that they're starting to infuse into their work. And so I see that happening across the board with other departments. Just transit was highlighted and uplifted throughout this process. It's going to be uplifted in the youth plan as well. So it's really important, those transit lines and how we communicate. And so one, it's relationship building. So I have to get out there. I'm out there meeting with leadership and folks in the community about it. Katie does the same thing, our equity team, our equity leadership. And we build those relationships and rapport. We talk about this plan, and we talk about what other organizations are doing already as well and how we can collaborate. We're going to do that with the school districts. We're going to do that with Cal State Long Beach and City College, all these different entities that we cannot do this alone. We have to be connected to. So that's in a nutshell.
I get it. So, the work, it's a lot of work ahead. Well, we can't tackle the issue of equity in one CiviTalks. We're definitely gonna revisit this a number of times with different areas of focus. I'm gonna wrap this up. A couple things. One, thanks to everybody for engaging in the Q&A. We tried to get as much in there. To Danny Gamboa, I agree. We shouldn't have to choose. The point I was trying to make is you shouldn't have to choose between clean air and your ability to work a job or have a job. The point is it has to be intersectional when you think about equity. That's the point there. So we've been given an unfair choice for many, many years on living in a place that we can afford, but also sacrificing our air quality as a part of it. That's an unfair choice, and we have to aspire to better. And that's the challenge we have on equity. We're going to keep doing this. We do this every 2 weeks. The next one, we're inviting Senator Lena Gonzalez and Michelle Martinez, California Transportation Commissioner, and representatives from CalSTART, which is the organization that represents clean electric vehicles. And we're going to have, and Senator Gonzalez is the new chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. And so I'm going to wear my SCAG, my Southern California Association of Governments president hat, and we're going to talk about transportation broadly, so infrastructure funding and all of those things that are coming down. So that is at our next one. Let me just pull that date. So that is on the 11th. And then 2 weeks from then, we're talking about Congress in the first 100 days of the presidential administration. We've confirmed Congressman Alan Lowenthal to come join us, and we have some other special guests in the works. And we're going to talk about, federal relief and what the first 100 days looks like. By that time, we should see potentially have already had a relief package funded by the federal government. So that's going to be an important conversation. You can follow the conversation at Facebook. Rex Richardson LB is our Facebook handle. On Twitter, it's also Rex Richardson LB. On Instagram, it's at Rex Richardson. Thank you all. Thank you, Alyssa and Teresa and D'Artagnan and Katie, for joining us. We will certainly have you back, maybe mix it up a little bit. In March, I will say in March, we are going to have a discussion on the region's inclusive recovery plan and Long Beach's inclusive recovery plan. So we may pull one of you in to help be a part of that conversation. Thank you all. Have a great night, and you can get back to your babies now. Take care.
Thanks, Rex. Bye.
Thank you.